Morning, everyone. I think we've got a decent amount of people who have joined us. So thanks very much. If this is your first time that you've joined Impero Talks, or whether you've joined us previously, thanks for doing so. Last time we were talking about the future of drink trends, and this time we've got Charlotte, who's our strategy director at Impero, who's going to be talking you through a framework to help you keep your brand agile in the fast-moving times that we currently live in. That's really our focus for this week's talk. It's always been super important for a brand to keep up with the ever-changing needs of consumers, but arguably it's never been so important than it is now, just to ensure that your brand doesn't get left behind and you make sure that you're cut through remaining relevant. So Charlotte's going to be taking you through a framework that can help you to do that. It's just Charlotte talking in today's session, but if you have any questions, then pop them into the Q&A tab on the toolbar at the bottom of Zoom, and then we'd be happy to discuss those questions at the end of the talk. So this should last about 30 minutes today, and then we can have a bit of a chat afterwards. So without further ado, I'm going to pass you over to Charlotte, who's going to take you through this presentation.
Thanks very much. Hi, everybody. Welcome. So I'm going to start off with something we know is true. So humans are a creature of habit, and this is something we have definitely observed over the last few months of disruption we've been experiencing. And never is that more prevalent than in some of our decisions we make every day. So, for example, where are you going online if you have a question? I mean, as much as we like to think we'll be pro and conning all of the search engines, the likelihood is Google is being typed in, right? And what if you need a book? As much as we think we're good people and we're very anti-Amazon, we're all about independent shopping, really, we want the book by tomorrow. So we're going to Amazon. But I got interested in this because why does that happen? And the reason is this number, so 35,000, that is the number of decisions the average person makes every single day. So if you're sitting there toing and froing about every single one, you're never going to leave the house and you'll never be able to get anything done. So that is why we create habits. That's why we kind of speed up that process, and it frees up our mind to be thinking of more important things, like, do you want oat milk with your flat white, for example? All these important questions. So with that in mind, that's great, right? So if you have habits, people love your brand, which is awesome. But because that would therefore mean that if you're a brand and you get a consumer, they're only staying with you. Their head is not being turned. You are their habit. So that's great. But that is not reality. We don't live in a sort of change-free utopian society free of disruption. Really, disruption now is a fact of life, and it's set to be that way, it would appear, for the foreseeable future. But disruption really happens all around us every day. So we've got people always moving house, for example. There are people changing jobs all the time. There are also people getting married all the time. And why that's interesting is a recent behavioural science study found that people are really, really likely to change their buyer behaviour after one of these life events. In fact, a very high percentage, so 75% of people were more likely to switch to a new product or brand after one of these personal life events happens to them. And even more interestingly, even categories and events that you would never think are connected were found to still be connected in some way. So it was quite conclusive that, for example, if you start a new job, you're quite likely to try a new beer, for example. And if you've recently moved house, you're quite likely to change to a new form of makeup. Odd, but true. And why I'm saying this is interesting now is that we're over 100 days into one of the biggest life events most of us have ever seen. And for the first time since 2008, when we had our last recession, this life event is global. It's something we're all experiencing together at the same time, which poses an interesting opportunity for brands, because therefore, if we kind of use the same rules and if they still apply, your competition's consumers will be more likely to switch to you, but also the opposite is true. So your consumers will also be more likely to switch to a competitor brand. So if it's becoming increasingly clear that disruption is now the norm, it's something we have to get quite comfortable with. What are you doing to remain visible and not be forgotten during these really changing times where consumer buyer behavior is really in flux, and it's now is the opportunity to really take control of the situation and use it as an opportunity for your brand? And the way we see it, there are two options really of how you can behave as a brand during times of disruption. The first is say nothing. Easy option. You can hang tight, you can wait for the dust to settle, you can come back when everything's back to normal, and you can roll out your 360 comms plan as planned, later date, all is good. I have a slight cautionary tale with that methodology. So thinking about way back to the late 1920s, when we had the Great Depression was the big disruptive global moment. And two brands, one Post cereal, you may or may not have heard of, and the other Kellogg's. So Post cereal decided to do nothing. They decided to halt all of their marketing spend, and they decided to wait until the dust had settled. But all that did was open the door to these three guys, Snap, Crackle and Pop, you may recognize them, and Kellogg's, to double down on their marketing activity, take that opportunity, seize that disruption, and in turn increase their profit by 30% during a depression, and also become the key player in their category. And actually where they still remain today. So really, that was a very detrimental decision to make, to do nothing. Option 2 is staying visible and flexing with disruption. I think you'll probably guess which one I prefer. So this is the kind of notion of the world is looking very different to how it did 3 months ago, 7 days ago, yesterday, earlier this morning. So why would you rest on your kind of laurels to how your marketing is going to roll out? And a great example of this really profiting a brand is Domino's. So the next big global disruption we had was 2008, so the recession then. And Domino's, instead of staying quiet, which they easily could have done, they doubled down on all of their marketing efforts. And what they actually did was really use that disruption as a time to invest in tech. So you may have used it previously, but their tracker app, where you can see your pizza being made and you see it being delivered, that was born out of this time. They really invested in new, exciting, innovative ways to connect with their consumers. And what that did was they had an increase in sales of 11%. And if you compare that to a normal kind of non-chaotic year for them, they were kind of averaging between 2 and 5% in terms of sales. Brands like Domino's, what they managed to do is they kind of play within this tension of agility. And what I mean by that is this kind of magical moment when the consumer expectation and moving with the times is on one side, but still staying true to your core your core brand values comes together. And what we refer to that as is the agility mindset. So this is a framework that I'm going to be walking you through quite top line today. And when we talk about agility, it's a word often thrown around with our clients, we like to break it down into kind of 4 fundamentals or 4 elements that I'll walk you through. The first is strength. And what I mean by that is brand strength. So how strong is your brand? How clear is your organizing thought? And how well are you sticking to it? 2 is speed. So this is all around decreasing friction. So right from your production and your creative ideation, right through to your delivery. The third is risk, and how do you quantify it? Are you a risk taker? Are you a risk avoider? And how can you lessen that risk to kind of create a more kind of innovative culture? And 4 is interaction. So much like that Domino's example, thinking about what other ways you can connect with your brand, with your consumer, and rethinking that. So kind of by rethinking how you approach these, you're really able to create a very flexible brand that's able to kind of move with the times and move with disruption. So we'll be walking through these today. And we'll start with strength. Really interesting report came out actually recently from BrandZ. So the top global brands, they track all of the value of these brands across time. So they've been very interested in looking at kind of what's been happening for the last few months. And they found that the world's most valuable brands actually still, despite COVID, increased in value by 5.9%. And what I kind of took from this and kind of the wider report, I really recommend having a look at it if you haven't already, is that it's, although very tempting to think very short term, kind of just get through this week, get through today, get to the end of this period of time, it's actually those really strong, confident brand comms that really stick with consumers. And it's still, even after the disruption is over, let's say, they're still holding dividends, they're still holding weight with consumers, and they're still being remembered by consumers. But I get it, staying focused is really hard. There are so many distractions, especially when you're kind of under pressure as a brand. You've got targets to hit, there's a new trend, a new channel, a new cause to back. Do we back it? There's new insights all the time that are solely there to distract you. So having that really clear focus, that laser focus on what your endpoint is, has never been more important. And I'm going to show you what can happen if you lose that focus. it kind of gets a bit weird, to be honest. It gets really weird. So when you kind of lose focus of what you put on this planet to do as a brand, strange things can happen. So the top example there is Colgate, famous for toothpaste, of course. But what they actually realized was their audience is really time poor, and they thought, we can support them in that, we can support them. So they created their own range of ready meals, which they called entrees, to fancy it up a bit. But as you can imagine, consumers were completely confused, had no idea where that's come from, and didn't particularly want to eat food made by a toothpaste brand. It was too far removed from their promise, the brand promise they'd made. And the same, of similar food, for the second example there, which is Cosmopolitan magazine. So in 1999, they conducted a survey which found that their audience was really into, get this, using food in the bedroom. So they thought, perfect, we're going to start our own range of yogurt and cheese products. Not sure how the two are connected in any way. And actually neither did consumers. They were actually taken off the shelf 18 months later and never spoken of again. And now they're kind of more of a kind of internet, an internet riddle. But so it's easy to see that without this clear organizing thought, and if you do have one and you just decide to go off piste, the strength of your brand can really, really suffer. It just gets very confusing for a consumer, even if it is deemed a good insight by you or your marketing team. But on the flip side, when it's done properly and when it's done right, and when you have a really clear organizing thought, it can be really powerful, a really powerful tool and a really helpful tool. So a great example is Adidas. So impossible is nothing is a line they've been using for a while. And you can see how it kind of flexes through their ideas. So the top one there is Reimagine Sports. So they were bringing out a range of inclusive sportswear. So impossible is nothing. They wanted to smash stereotypes of what it meant to have the perfect sport body. And you can see how that really is powerful. It's creating change, it's moving with culture, it's staying true to their brand. And the bottom example, which, I mean, I won't pretend to fully understand how this works, but they've created a connected sole that you put in your shoe, which when you're playing football in the real world, it will increase or decrease, depending how good you are, how well your team on FIFA Mobile is doing. So playing connected. So they're really merging the two worlds of their consumers. Really interesting concept, and still linked to that impossible is nothing. How can they do that? You can see how they got there. Another good example, and this is one of ours, so I'll be humble, but is Nature Valley. So they came with us. It's a good example because they came to us with exactly that problem of short-termism. They were really, really into short-term thinking, instant results, and they were really experiencing a lack of consistency across the board, all of their markets. They weren't really sure when to kind of be visible, when to not be visible, how to make those decisions. So what we did was give them this organizing thought. So Get Out More was our line, and that was really making them the facilitator for getting an indoor generation outdoors. And the irony is not lost on me when we came to this line and then lockdown hit, but we'll go into later how we dealt with that. Agile thinking is how we dealt with that, spoiler. So you can see how it kind of just really helps them to create a quality control, if you will. So kind of when to speak, when to not speak, and will really make their money go further, be more impactful. And to kind of end on this section, I'm going to end with a silly analogy, best way to remember something. So really, to me, a strong brand is like a strong date. So if you remember anything, remember this. So they know what they're after. So they know what moments to be visible and when to not. They ooze confidence. So they know where their point of view is, what side of the fence they're on, and they don't deviate from that. They avoid small talk. So they use their brand to move culture forward. Their ideas will be kind of really closely linked to culture and really move the conversation forwards. And most importantly, they never ghost. So they're always visible. And when the going gets tough, especially, think back to that Domino's example, they are there, they are present. So that's number one. So strength, building your strong foundation. So really what this does is ensuring you have a really, really strong foundation so you can move on to the next elements of the agility mindset. Because without that, you're really going to run into trouble and it'll probably do more harm than good. The next one we're going to talk about is speed. So there are many reasons why speed can be hampered in a business or with a creative process. And I've isolated three just to chat you through, as I probably feel they're most common amongst the group we have here. So the first being hierarchy. So thinking about how many layers and how many blockers, barriers to kind of entry or exit do you have from your brand or from your team to get stuff done and get stuff into the world. Number 2 is inflexibility. So thinking about your channels and how you are using them, and what happens if one of your channels is not possible. How quick are you to move to something else? And number 3 is overthinking, which I probably imagine all of us have experienced. It's almost that paralysis feeling you get when you're like, should I say something? Should I not? And kind of how we can mediate that as well. But really, these are false constraints. So these are constraints we place on ourselves. They are fixable. There are things you can do to kind of make them a little bit better and a little bit easier for your team. So we'll start with hierarchy. And when I was researching this topic, I was kind of trying to find kind of great examples of kind of brands that have suffered this. And one that was quite unexpected in my eyes came up. That was Snapchat. And being a tech company, I always thought they would have it down. They'd be so agile. There'd be like 2 guys just working in a garage, just getting stuff out there. And that is how it started. But then when they became bigger and they grew, Evan Spiegel found that he was still bottlenecking his entire business. So that thing he created, he was bottlenecking it. He wanted creative sign-off, strategic sign-off, development sign-off, and he was driving his team insane. And he was also driving consumers insane, because it meant that they were not spending energy on the right areas, because his objective would be different to kind of those working on the ground with the team, with the engagement teams. So what he did, he realized, and what he did was really try to foster this culture of innovation. So what he did was base this on his days at art college, and how you have crits. So people are expected to bring stuff to the table, you are held accountable, but you're given the freedom to kind of move your own project forward. So he was then taking a step back, not bottlenecking his entire team and business, and creating what we call a culture of autonomy. So where people feel empowered, they have freedom, and it really allows them to live and breathe the brand. So then a good idea can come from anywhere. And it allows you to kind of ask quite hard questions, what are called kind of heretical questions, kind of to really push creativity. And when you do that and you give your team that empowerment to do so, that's when you really start to see the velocity of the ideas coming out the door really ramp up. The second enemy of speed is inflexibility. And I think this is one we've really seen like really good examples of over the last couple of months. But really this is removing friction. And friction can obviously appear at any point. So kind of the examples we have here is one of ours as well. So Mike's, they were launching their new product this summer, huge launch, and then lockdown hit. So we needed to shoot a whole campaign with no access to studios, no access to photographers. So what we did was we shot it in our producer's living room. And I think you can't tell, right? So it's really amazing what you can achieve. And I think when you're taking away some of the luxuries we're used to, actually friction can be removed quite simply, and kind of being quite entrepreneurial with how you're creating your content. We've done this, we've done shoots in living rooms, we've done influencer outreach and influencer partnerships. There's a lot of ways you can still keep your messaging present and visible without having to rely on kind of the luxuries we had outside of lockdown. The second example there is KFC. So they obviously had a nightmare when all of their brick and mortar stores were shut. So instead of just going quiet, they appeared in an unexpected place. So they appeared in Animal Crossing with a virtual store, so consumers could still interact with their brand even when they're sitting on their sofa. And then finally, a more kind of serious note, this is a foundation, a domestic violence foundation in Colombia, who would normally be doing kind of really big out-of-home campaigns. But obviously when lockdown came, out-of-home was not an option, but domestic violence was still on the rise. So they took it upon themselves, it's a really smart idea, to partner with Face App, which we probably know as that app you use to see what you'd look like when you're old. They used to sort of put men in women's shoes. So by changing them to a woman who has suffered domestic abuse, it really showed men quite viscerally what it's like to be a woman in Colombia during lockdown sometimes. So like really powerful, and actually probably a lot more powerful than if they'd kind of gone with their original plan. And the last enemy is overthinking. And I think this one, to be honest, is probably the most linked to your strong brand organizing thought, because overthinking really comes when you are not sure, you're kind of working on shifting sand, you're not sure what your opinion is. And that's really hard, because that's when you can mess up. And I think kind of good examples of kind of from the serious to the silly are Ben & Jerry's. So they are not notoriously a super serious brand, but they definitely know their opinion. And they're almost expected now when something happens in the world and culture, they will comment. So they really know who they are and they really know the right tone to take. So kind of they move really fast, and by doing so, they do fail less. And I think over the years, they've kind of learned this kind of move quick, fail fast models really benefited them, because they can see the opportunities that are right for them, know exactly what to say. It's a really good example if you needed some resources to look it up. The second being, to the silly, is Rate My KFC. So again, they completely nail the tone. So they obviously had a huge increase in people trying to rip off their product at home in various levels of terrible ways. So they took it upon themselves. They know who they are. They know their tone. They took it upon themselves to just be self-deprecating and take the piss a bit, really. And it really was one of the highlights of their campaign for lockdown. And the third is what we did with Nature Valley when we have to move quickly. So when you're telling a nation to get outside, but the government is telling you not to, what do you do? So we pivoted their plan to get more out. So we kind of were looking into trends within a lockdown period. We found that mindfulness and kind of people's appreciation of nature was on the rise. So we answered that by bringing nature to them, by creating a series of ASMR videos that brought nature straight to your headphones. So kind of that moving quick, seizing those opportunities, but really knowing which ones to choose thanks to your organizing thought. But we know speed as a concept is obviously very high demand with everyone, all our clients, always speed is of the essence, but time really is in short supply. So this is why we set up a new initiative for Impero that I wanted to tell you about. So this is kind of almost speed strategy, if you will. So calling it 9 to 5 strategy, where we're inviting clients, prospective and new and old, to come to us with a really isolated problem. So what is it in your process where you have isolated friction, and how can we help you with that? So then we'll spend a day with our crack team of creatives and strategists, and we'll come back to you with a really focused answer, because we've really found that the more focused the input, the more focused the output, and the more impact you have. So do drop us a line if this is something you'd like to have a go at. We found it, to be really effective in kind of isolating, knowing which problems are the right problems to fix, essentially. And so for speed, you really have to fight your enemies of speed to stay nimble, but really focus on which enemies you can fight efficiently. The third element is in our agility mindset is risk, and knowing how you weigh it up. So what is it that stops us from taking risks with our campaigns? On one side, it could be reputational costs. So what if it doesn't work? What if my boss thinks I'm an idiot? What if my client thinks I'm an idiot? What if it doesn't work and everyone sees us fail? It's like an internal monologue. But also opportunity cost. So what could we spend this money on elsewhere? Is there a safer option, a more guaranteed return? All of those kind of questions that you definitely will be asking yourself when you're briefing in your agencies. But what this comes down to is basically jargon for fear of failure. We're all just scared of failing. And a quote I always go back to is a really nice one from Pixar, where they really reframe failure. And as I was researching this, I just thought it was quite a nice way of thinking about it, because it's actually not as black and white as it may seem. So they see failure isn't a necessary evil. In fact, it isn't evil at all. It's a necessary consequence of doing something new, which really makes it much more of a positive experience. It's not kind of fail or win. It's kind of like you do something new, you learn. And he actually goes on to say, if you spend your life trying to avoid failure, you actually end up just failing, because you haven't given yourself anything to learn from, to improve upon, to build upon. So like that, trying something new is really key, and having a culture that encourages that. And probably the most famous example of this is Google. So you may have heard of their 20% rule. So this was the rule that 20% of a Googler's time will be spent on passion projects. That's about 1 day a week. And this is how they kind of mediate the risk of trying something new. So it's only 20%. What's the worst that can happen, essentially? And if something good happens, brilliant. And if something bad happens, doesn't matter. It's 20%. And the reason I call it a myth is actually because their ex-CEO, Marissa Mayer, came out and said that it was more like the 120% rule, because it kind of, you do your day job and then this becomes your night job. We all know that, right? So, but that's not really the point. The point is they fostered a culture where it was okay to kind of think outside of the status quo. And what that actually did was create some of their most famous products. So Google Home, Google Mail, and Google News were all created as a result of this kind of personal time, or 20% time. And Contagious, actually, in their brand commandments, put it really well. It doesn't actually matter whether you're spending 0.5%, 5%, or 50% of your time, energy, and resources committed to experimentation and developing new ideas, because actually, if you don't do that, you're going to get left behind by those who do. So if you don't think it's important, another brand will think it is important, and they will be doing that. So kind of, it's not the amount of money you're putting towards something, it's kind of that creating that environment where people feel comfortable to do that. And Mitch had some great advice on kind of, again, reframing. So quite like Pixar do, reframing failure, or kind of, you know, going into a project. It's not, will it work? Because that is very high pressure, very kind of, there's a win and a lose in that situation. Instead, think of it as, if it worked, would it improve my brand? Because then you're kind of creating your own quality control on a project. So if you're going into it being like, yeah, it actually would. So if it worked, brilliant. If it doesn't, it still would have improved your brand, and it's still kind of a good, it's energy well spent. And if it didn't work, and if the answer is no to that question, maybe you shouldn't be spending your energy on that project. So for risk and how you kind of quantify that, you need to reframe failure and invest in a culture of experimentation. So the final element I'd like to take you through is interaction. So 5,000. So 5,000 is the average number of adverts an adult sees every day. And actually, I reckon this has probably increased in the last few months as people are kind of, and more is cluttering up the internet as everyone's been pivoting through to a digital plan. So it does make sense that we're always kind of under pressure to find new ways to kind of cut through, to connect, to emotionally connect with your consumers and avoid the dreaded wallpaper effect. So the dreaded kind of scrolling and no one noticing all the hard work you put into that beautifully crafted social post. That is a travesty. So we need to stop becoming wallpaper. And actually, Arjaz Ahmed puts this really well. He's the ex-AKQA head. So we're in an age of connectedness. The solution is to create work that people want to share, ideas that define culture rather than follow it. And I think that's a really nice like guiding light for all of us. That's exactly what we all should be aiming towards, is that need for connectedness and kind of harnessing how connected the world now is. And I don't think anything really shows us quite so blatantly as the rise in esports and primarily Twitch. So kind of their hours watched have increased by nearly 100% since the last quarter of last year. So there's definitely a hunger and a thirst for consumers to be closer to the action. So immersed in experiences rather than just be kind of a passive viewer, kind of looking in, because that's all they do. Like, you know, you are overwhelmed by content and messaging. So kind of, we need to kind of break through that wall. Which means as brands, we have great opportunity. I see it as a really fun opportunity to create new worlds to explore. So the first example here we have is Nike. So instead of telling people in a beautifully crafted social post alone that their trainers, their React trainers were super good for running, super kind of agile to run around in, they showed them by creating these pop-ups where you could star in your own game. So you're running on a treadmill, you've got your avatar, you're jumping over stuff. And then I believe they sent you back with a video so you can kind of remember the experience. So kind of that personalized, that ownership over it. And how that resulted for them was they sold twice the amount of trainers than they were anticipating. So it's really powerful by bringing consumers into your world to experience it closer than ever before. And another more recent example is Lynx. So they were celebrating their 25th birthday, and actually this hit just as lockdown was happening, I believe. So it was difficult because they were like, right, okay, we've really lessened the channels in which we can activate in. But it really didn't matter, because what they did was created this ulterior universe, all styled on kind of nostalgic cues for consumers to explore. Because even though actually I reckon quite a lot of their consumers maybe weren't even alive in 95, which is quite depressing, but it really tapped into their love of nostalgia, and it just brought them closer, and it made quite an objectively kind of dull message, we're turning 25, into something really interesting and really exciting and super immersive. It also creates new reasons for brands to interact. So this kind of need for connectedness, this kind of hunger for connected experiences from consumers. And a really nice example I saw from Nike again was Sneaker Stash. So this is using geolocation technology to really speak to kind of their really hardcore sneakerhead community they have in their audience. And it meant that they could use geolocation to unlock exclusive products hidden throughout their city. So really fun, almost doesn't feel like you're being advertised to or you're having an interaction with a brand. It's a really native experience for someone that's really into trainers. So I thought that was a really great way of, instead of just advertising, bringing them in. And secondly, we've got Deliveroo on Animal Crossing, all the food people on Animal Crossing. So again, when delivery was down over lockdown, they had to think of new innovative ways to interact with their consumers and appearing in really unexpected places like Animal Crossing. Great example of how to interact and keep your brand front of mind during times of disruption. Because we're in the memory game, right? So we need to keep us present and keep us visible. And it comes down to this section of kind of how to interact and why it's important, to a painfully simple principle that was outlined by System 1. So when a consumer feels more, they literally do buy more. So kind of bringing them closer and bringing them into the brand and giving them something to explore and immerse themselves in is a great idea to kind of, especially through times of disruption, to make people feel closer to your brand and more a part of it. And what better time to invest in tech and those sorts of experiences than through times of disruption when digital has never been more important. So finally, interaction. So don't be wallpaper, provide social currency for your consumers, give them something to talk about because they can do a lot of the heavy lifting for you. And they can be, as long as they keep talking, you will keep being remembered and you'll stay on that radar. So just to wrap up really quick. So there's obviously kind of loads more I could talk about with all of these topics. So if you are interested in hearing more, I would love to hear from you all and we can chat more about any of these elements. But as we know, disruption is the new norm. So we're going to be using this agility mindset to harness disruption, and we advise you to keep your brand firmly on the consumer radar. No matter what happens around them, they will be remembering you. And to do that, you need to build your strong foundations, keep your focus, don't be distracted. Remember, be a good date. Speed, find the enemies of speed and stay nimble. So really focus your energies on what you can change. How can you remove that friction? Risk, reframe failure. Don't see it as a black and white win or lose situation. Invest in experimentation and kind of lessen that risk barrier. And finally, interaction. Don't be wallpaper, provide social currency, keep your consumers talking. And that is it from me. Thank you very much.
Great. Right, thanks very much, Charlotte. So thank you all for joining us. There don't seem to be any questions in the Q&A tab. If you do have any, pop them in now, but otherwise I'll wrap up. As Charlotte has said, if you've got any queries on anything she's discussed, she's very open for you to get in touch with her. She's Charlotte@weareimpero.com. I'd just like to say that we've done a number of these webinars now since lockdown, whereas before we would do just 3 physical events a year. We're aiming to do a lot more, and we have a number of ones which we're currently working on in the next few months. But previous to this, we talked about the future of drink trends. We talked about how to do a successful NPD launch. We've covered Gen Z. So if there are any other subjects which are relevant to your industry, your category, your brand that you'd be interested in us putting a webinar around and giving some thought to, then please drop me an email. I'm Coris, that's CORIS @weareimpero.com. Let me know what you think would be really interesting for us to do a bit of a deep dive into, and we'd be happy to give that some consideration and look into it for future webinars. So we do have one Q&A, one question that's just popped in. This is from Penny. At our client. Hi Penny. She said, I really need this to disrupt my short-termism right now. Looking forward to our strategy sessions.
Go away.
We are too. Yes, so thanks very much. Like I said, please get in touch with us. We are really happy to kind of look into other areas because we intend to put on a lot more webinars throughout the year, and any feedback is welcome to the format. We often have some speakers involved as well, and that's something that we're always looking for people brand side to come and share their experiences. Often it's great to hear what's worked well, but in the past we've had the marketing director of Union Hand Roasted Coffee, and she came on just to tell us her war stories and examples of where failures have happened and what she learned. So very much interested to hear from you from that point of view. So yep, thank you very much, Charlotte. It's been brilliant.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you again.
Cheers, bye.